chapter 4. Let's open our Bibles to Mark chapter 4. We're going to be looking today at verses 35 through verse 41. Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. One more prayer request I wanted to make mention of this morning is Tim isn't here to work the technology for us today because his wife, Michelle, was having a seizure yesterday. And so he's having to stay home to take care of her for the next few days. He said that she hasn't had one in quite some time, but because of maybe a recent change in medication, that's what's caused him to come back. And so he's hoping that once she gets acclimated to the medication that she'll be okay. But just be keeping her and Tim in your prayers. But that's why we have Troy and Presley and Brindley helping us out with the technology this morning. And they're doing a pretty good job. It's one of the first times, I think, doing it on a Sunday morning. Did I say Troy? Oh my goodness, Audrey. I'm sorry. Audrey and Presley and Brindley. You know, Audrey and Troy, they're just alike in every way, so it's easy to get them confused. And I don't know who's going to be more mad at me for saying that, so I guess we'll find out when we're playing badminton later on this evening. Okay, Mark chapter 4, 35 through 41. The scripture says, "On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, 'Let us go across to the other side.' And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, 'Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?' And waking up, he rebuked the wind and said to the sea, 'Be silent, be still.' Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. And he said to them, 'Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?' And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, 'Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?'" Can you cut me down just a little bit, Jason? Thank you. All right, let's go back through this passage. And we're going to do it in three different ways. You see, we live today in a disenchanted world. In our post-Enlightenment, modern worldview, we don't really think that anything like this is possible in our day and time, right? When we go into the garden to pick our vegetables and our fruit, we don't expect to find a talking snake. When we're going down the road on our donkeys, which we don't ride, we don't expect our donkey to talk to us like it did in the Bible story Caden and I and Laura and Ellie Shea read last night. We don't expect to be riding on a boat and someone to stand up and say, "Peace, be still," and the winds to calm. We think that all of that was back there somewhere. And so often we miss out on the power of these stories because of our disenchanted worldview. Let me give you an example of this. In the Old Testament, there was this great creature, this sea beast called Leviathan. He breathed fire, and his tail was so thick he could chop down cedars and whatnot, and it was terrifying. And for many, many years, not just back in the Hebrew scriptures, but even in medieval times, there was a great fear of these kinds of mythical beasts, right? On some maps in the unknown territories, it would say, "Here be dragons," so as to ward people off from traveling into unknown places. When you're out in the boat, you're worried that not just the wind and the waves would get you, but that maybe some sea creature unknown to you would get you. Now, in our day, we know the classifications of all the animals. We know their scientific names. We can point them out on pictures, what kind of shark it is or what kind of whale it is. And we don't go out onto the Gulf of Mexico fearing that some kind of great sea beast is going to capsize the boat and pull us all under. We're not really worried about stuff like that. We're not worried that every time we go into the Smoky Mountains, we might have to be afraid of that dragon that lives between the hills. Like, we just don't think about stuff like that, right? But for the apostles and for the early Christians, this was a very real reality. These were things talked about in the scriptures. These were things talked about in popular culture. There were things that they worried about. And many of the ancient stories reflect this enchanted worldview, which might seem very strange to the worldview that we have. And so, for example, when Jesus is standing on the deck and the winds are crashing and the wave is blowing, this is more to them than just a bizarre weather event. There's chaotic forces of evil going on here, literally beneath the surface of the water. This is more than just some kind of strange rainstorm. One time when we were out on the boat with Jeremy and his family, we got caught in a big rainstorm. It was pretty scary. I think Allie and Anna Kate, were you with us? You were there that day? And it was really terrifying. I mean, the waves were going, the wind was blowing, but, Troy wasn't sitting over there to the side going, oh, man, I hope the Kraken's not about to capsize our boat and pull us all under. That'd be terrible. I mean, we just knew that the rain would eventually pass. And Jason promised that it would pass 3 or 4 times, and it never did. But he thought he had it under control, but he didn't, right? Okay, he says he got it figured out. But regardless, you see, it's very natural, very natural. It's raining, the rain's going to pass, we're going to be okay, maybe a hole in the boat, but we'll survive. For the apostles, though, this is more than just a rainstorm. In their ancient, enchanted worldview, who knows what was going to come out of the water? In fact, in several passages in both the Old and New Testament, it's not just sea creatures that come out of the water, but evil itself is pictured as coming up out of the water. In Daniel chapter 7, Daniel saw this vision where these different strange beasts were coming up out of the water, and these beasts represented different empires, one right after the other. And finally, there was this beast that had no name, and they didn't really understand the form of it, and it was scarier than all the rest. And the same thing happens in Revelation. The evil powers of the world are pictured as coming up out of the water. So when we read this story again, let's not just picture the wind and the waves, but let's picture what's maybe wandering right beneath the surface. On that day when evening had come, he says in verse 35, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion, and they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And waking up, he rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Be silent, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. Do you see how much more powerful this story becomes when you realize their enchanted worldview? These stories of these mythical beasts, these stories of evil just beneath the surface, it's more than just a windstorm to them, which is really impressive to us. There's a whole world of evil, of chaos lurking beneath the surface that Jesus is bringing to a calm. This story of Jesus speaking through the Spirit, this word, "be silent, be still," over the waters, is reminiscent of another story in the Old Testament as well. Way early in the Hebrew Scriptures, at the very beginning, there's a passage that says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and was void, and the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the deep." And out of these chaotic waters come the creation, light, and then the grass and trees and flowers and the sun and the moon and the stars and animals and even humankind itself comes up out of these chaotic waters. It's something that God speaks over. He calls the chaos to become ordered. He calls the darkness and the void nature of the sea, he calls it to be calm and start this new kind of creation, this new way of ordering the world right there in Genesis chapter 1. Jesus is doing the same thing here in Mark 4, both in the particular instance of calming the waters of the sea that were all thrashing this way and the wind was blowing this way and that and scaring his disciples, but he's speaking calm over a different kind of sea. Because for Jesus, his mission was to come and to overturn the tables of the empire. He was to come and give a new kind of kingdom. As Mark begins his gospel, Jesus came preaching the good news of the kingdom of heaven that would be totally different from any kind of kingdom they would ever expect. And so when Jesus stands up on the deck of the boat and hears all the wind and the waves thrashing around him, and he says, "Be silent, be still," this is Jesus calming a windstorm. This is Jesus calming the chaos of the sea that was inherently enchanted and otherworldly in some perspectives in the ancient world. But this is Jesus also speaking a word of "be silent, be still" over the empire. He's living in a world where his people are oppressed. His people have been without their own king for hundreds and hundreds of years, taken into Babylonian captivity, taken into Medo-Persian captivity. They were passed down to Grecian captivity, and then finally now here they are under their Roman oppressors, without a king on the throne, without their own freedom, without the promises of God in the Old Covenant being yet fulfilled. They're waiting for all this. And Jesus stands above all this and he says, "Be silent, be still." So you have the waters just being waters on the very surface level, maybe from our perspective. It's just about the wind and the waters. But at a deeper level, there's this enchanted view of the sea. It's the place of chaos. It's where the sea monsters come from. It's where the danger arrives. And then on this deepest level, then, you have Jesus calming the waters of the world, setting things right. Because remember, in their perspective, from these passages I mentioned in Daniel and in Revelation, the water is where the beasts come that torment God's people, that cast them into prison, that overly tax them, that set up systems of injustice to rob them and make them less than human. And Jesus is coming and he's saying, peace, be still. When we read this story operating at all three levels, we move from something that just happened back there somewhere that can't be reproduced in our own time to some really good news that we can say in our own culture today. We can look out at the systems of injustice in the world, at situations where bad things are happening to good people, or the situations where the bad guy seems to always win. And we can say, be silent, be still, or peace, be still. We can look at the waters of chaos in our world from every level, from a global level to a national level to a community level, and we can say, peace, be still. In other words, because of the good news of Jesus, we're able to help rearrange this world, to bring order out of chaos, to participate with God in the revelation of the new creation. In other words, things don't have to be the way that they are. That is good news. Now, to the people in power, this isn't good news at all. It's very scary. But as this poor man from Nazareth is floating across the waters with his best friends, and they become scared, and he's able to say, peace, be still, so too are we in our own time and culture, able to stand on the deck of the ship, which at a lot of times when you observe our culture seems to be sinking very quickly, and we're able to say, peace, be still as well. Not only that, to echo one of the songs that we sang a moment ago, when it appears like the storms are raging in our life, God is able to speak into that. Peace, be still. The circumstances might still be there, but the peace can be there regardless of the circumstances. Now look at what Jesus says in verse 40. Jesus says to them, after the wind has ceased and there was a dead calm, he says, why are you afraid? Have you still no faith? I don't know about you, but this seems a little bit like an unfair question from Jesus. I mean, there's a storm. The deck is being swamped with water. It looks like they're going to go down with the ship. And Jesus is asleep on the cushion in the interior of the boat. That seems like a pretty good situation to be afraid in. But Jesus knew apparently something else that they didn't know. He knew where the story had to go. He knew that he would survive this trip across the sea. But for them, it was the most terrifying situation. I don't look at this passage as Jesus getting on to his disciples, like how we might read it, like, why are you afraid? What's wrong with you? Instead, I think what Jesus is doing is he's inviting us here to take a nap with him in the bottom of the ship while the storm rages on outside. He's inviting us to find the peace and comfort even in the most difficult situations in our life. We just had so many prayer requests this morning about people battling with cancer, about people dealing with the death of a loved one, about those struggling with, in our prayer lists, those struggling with all different sorts of problems. And while the waters might not ever become still externally, Jesus in this passage invites us to experience still waters internally, to go with him into the depths of the ship, even while the storm rages on, and to take a nap on a cushion. Now that's difficult to do. And it's difficult to have the faith and the trust to do that. But the reality is sometimes the waters don't become still in our lives. Sometimes we do go down with the ship. But knowing that God is with us even in those moments is the epitome of faith. Now, there's a question here that the disciples ask at the very end of the passage. They say, who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? Just read that one more time. Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? I mean, can you imagine being in their shoes? But also, isn't it impressive how we would think that they would kind of get it at this point? After all the miracles and healings and things that Jesus did, like why are they still wondering who he is? And yet they had all kinds of questions about who Christ was. He still saved them on the boat, though, didn't he? Even though they had questions about who he was and how all that worked, he still stood up and saved them on the boat. He invited them into a deeper faith, and yet he still saved them on the boat. Sometimes I think that we feel like we have to have it all figured out before Jesus will come into our lives and fix things or save us, before he calms the waters. We feel like we have to have him exactly pegged down with all the beliefs memorized and all the arguments articulated perfectly in our minds. And yet here, Jesus saves them before they're able to figure out exactly who he is. Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? In other words, we all have faith in Jesus. We all believe that he's the Son of God. We all believe that through dying on the cross, he defeated death. He overcame the principalities and powers of darkness that are in the world. And yet, there's a lot of questions we don't have the answers to. And sometimes because of our culture, we think that not having the answers to those questions disqualify us from him working in our lives. And yet here we see that despite their doubts, despite their fear, Jesus still stood up on the boat and saved them. I think that's another word of encouragement for us today as well, because sometimes we don't have the answers and we don't know where to turn, and yet Christ is still for us and with us. And so it causes us to ask, who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? How does this passage challenge us to live today? How does this passage challenge us to live as a church, as just a human being living in the world? Well, we might ask the same question in our own lives: who is this? Who is this Jesus? Who is this Christ? But we understand that the answer to this question doesn't lead to being able to answer questions on a test, but it leads to being able to sleep in the bottom of the ship during a storm. It's less about memorizing facts about who Jesus is and more about having trust in him as the one who brings salvation and peace to this very stormy and windy world, right? Do you see that in the passage? It's less about memorizing who Jesus is and more about having trust in him as he is, as we grow up in him and learn more about him, as we walk with him in our lives. This passage also encourages us to have the courage that when everything seems to be going wrong, to stand up and give that opposing voice, to stand up and speak a voice of peace in this world of chaos in which we live. We don't have to sit by in fear. We don't have to cower to the side. We can boldly stand up on the deck and say, "Peace, be still," and believe that through God's working in the world, that peace really will come. That we really do live in a universe that's on a trajectory towards peace. That whenever Jesus was there on the cross and he said, "Father, forgive them for that don't know what they're doing," that they really were forgiven. And that God really did want to have a relationship with them. And that God really wants to have a relationship with us. And that through Jesus' death and resurrection, we live in a new world. And while our modern worldview might think that this world is disenchanted, what the story of Scripture tells us is that God is not distant off somewhere, but that God is working within our world, within our hearts. He's working through us. God is working through the Spirit of God. And if we put our faith in Christ, if we put our faith in the Spirit that works within us, then we can be an active participant in this new creation as well. Jesus speaks peace over the chaotic waters, and from the chaotic waters comes a new kind of order, comes a new kind of creation. And you and I have been invited to participate in this wonderful work of new creation. We might not always have all the answers. We might sometimes be filled with doubts and fears. And yet here's Jesus, asleep on the cushion in the boat, ready at a moment's notice to pop up and say, "Peace, be still," if we'll simply let him in our lives. And maybe even we can join him on the nap on the next voyage, right? That's my hardest trouble. One more thing I want to mention about this passage that stands out to me, and then we'll be done here. Notice verse 36. Jesus has just had a very successful day. And this happens all throughout Mark. He has talked about parables. He has given all kinds of great teaching. He has delivered all these sermons. And then the scripture says in verse 36, leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. And it was Jesus that initiated that. He said, "Let us go across to the other side." Notice that Jesus was not interested in staying with the crowds and capitalizing on his success. Jesus wasn't interested in setting up maybe the best synagogue in the world right there on that seashore. He wanted to go and get his work done on the other side. Many times when we have to speak this expression, peace be still, in our chaotic world, it won't just be us leaving the crowds behind. Sometimes it'll be the crowds leaving us behind. But we have to have the courage to do that, to step beyond our comfort zone, to step beyond what might be conventional wisdom, what everybody expects out of us, and to step onto this boat with Christ. We have to not be willing just to leave the crowds, but we have to be willing for the crowds to sometimes leave us. Because when you speak this word, it's not going to be very popular. All right, I think that's about it. It's pretty good. Anybody else have anything from this passage you want to share? I've never asked that question before. I don't know where that came from. What you got? Anybody? Okay. Oh, well, okay. What you got? Who knows what happens when you say that question? Just as he was. I don't know. That popped out to me a couple times too. What does that phrase, just as he was, mean? I don't know. I guess it just means that they didn't make any special preparations. They just went on their trip. And I guess that's sometimes what we have to do when we're ready to go with Jesus, right? He just takes us as we are. That'd have been a good song to sing, wouldn't it, Jason? Just as I am. Dude, Miss D caught that before I did those, so we have to invite her to our sessions where we pick out songs. Okay. Anybody else have anything? All right, well, that was fun. Who knew that was going to happen? I surely didn't. All right, we're about to sing a song. What's it called?